Welcome to this journey through one of the most relentlessly accumulating winters ever to descend upon the Ozark Mountains. In the years when snow was expected and endured, when winter brought weeks of white landscape and cold that tested every family's preparations and resilience, when the end of snowfall and the beginning of melt marked the transition from hardship toward relief, there came a winter when the snow simply would not stop falling, when accumulation continued day after day and week after week beyond any natural limit, when the valley filled with white that rose higher and higher until it threatened to bury everything beneath it. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the snowfall that forgot how to end. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we watch that snow accumulate beyond reason, consider what snowfall meant on the frontier and why its eventual cessation was as important as the warmth that would follow. Snow was seasonal, temporary, self-limiting. It fell during winter months, accumulated to depths that varied by year and location, but always stopped falling eventually. Always gave way to periods of clear weather that allowed the snow to compact or melt. Always maintained a balance between addition and removal that prevented infinite accumulation. This reliability was fundamental to how frontier people planned and survived. You knew snow would come, knew it would accumulate to some depth, knew it would eventually stop and begin to melt. A snowfall that refused to stop, that continued adding depth day after day without pause or limit, violated this fundamental assumption about how winter worked. It represented not just unusual weather, but a breakdown in the natural cycles that made seasonal survival predictable and manageable. And it created a terror that was unique and profound, the slow, relentless burial of everything under an accumulation that showed no signs of ever ending. The year 1844 marked the early period of permanent settlement in the Ozark Mountains, particularly in the steep valleys and hollows that characterized the region's most rugged terrain. The settlement in Blackwell Hollow consisted of 7 families who had established homesteads along approximately 2 miles of a creek that ran through a narrow valley between steep ridges. The hollow was isolated even by frontier standards, accessible only by rough trails that required significant effort to traverse even in good weather, connected to larger settlements by routes that took days to travel. The families in Blackwell Hollow were experienced frontier people who had survived multiple winters in the location and who understood the rhythms and demands of seasonal survival. They knew to prepare extensively for winter, to lay in supplies that would last for months without resupply, to gather enough firewood to maintain heat through extended cold periods, and to accept that winter meant isolation and that endurance rather than activity would be their primary task until spring. Winter began normally in 1844, with the first substantial snow falling in late November. This was expected and unremarkable, perhaps 6 inches of accumulation, followed by several days of cold weather that kept the snow on the ground, followed by a warming period that melted much of it. This pattern of snow, cold, partial melt, repeated through December in ways that were entirely consistent with previous winters the families had experienced. The snowfall that would define the winter of 1844 to 1845 began on January 3rd. It started as a typical winter storm, steady snow falling from gray overcast skies, accumulating at a rate of perhaps an inch per hour, creating the kind of heavy snowfall that experienced weather observers could recognize as likely to produce significant accumulation. The families in Blackwell Hollow watched the snow begin and made their standard preparations for a winter storm, ensuring adequate firewood was brought inside, securing livestock in barns, and settling in to wait for the storm to pass. By evening of January 3rd, approximately 12 inches of new snow had fallen. This was heavy, but not extraordinary for a winter storm in the region. The families expected that the snowfall would taper off overnight, or by the following morning, that they would wake to clearing skies and to the task of dealing with whatever depth had accumulated. But the snow did not stop. Through the night of January 3rd and into the day of January 4th, it continued falling at the same steady rate, approximately an inch per hour, hour after hour, without variation or pause. By the evening of January 4th, another 24 inches had accumulated on top of the previous day's 12 inches, bringing total accumulation to 36 inches, 3 feet of snow in 36 hours. This was becoming unusual. Heavy snowfalls in the region typically lasted 6 to 12 hours, occasionally extending to 24 hours, but rarely longer. A snowfall that continued for 36 hours without pause was notable and concerning. But the family still expected that the storm would end soon, that the next morning would bring clearing, that what they were experiencing was simply an unusually persistent weather system that would eventually exhaust itself. The snow continued through January 5th. Another 24 inches fell, bringing total accumulation to 60 inches. 5 feet of snow in 3 days. The depth was now beyond anything the families had experienced in their years in the hollow. Movement outside the cabins required wading through snow that was waist-deep. Travel between homesteads was becoming impossible, and livestock that had been sheltered in barns were running low on hay that could not be replenished because accessing storage areas outside the barn required traversing snow that was too deep for safe movement. Still, the families maintained their composure and their confidence that the snowfall would end. 5 feet of snow was extraordinary, but not catastrophic if it stopped soon, if the skies cleared and the accumulation was given time to compact and settle. The cabins were secure, food supplies were adequate, firewood was sufficient, and as long as the snow stopped within a day or two, the situation remained manageable. But January 6th brought another 24 inches, 84 inches total, 7 feet of snow in 4 days. The snow was now reaching the lower edges of cabin roofs, was creating drifts that completely buried smaller outbuildings, was accumulating on roof surfaces in ways that created concerns about structural integrity under the weight. And more troubling than the depth was the relentless continuation. The snow fell at the same steady rate, hour after hour, day after day, with no sign of slowing or stopping. By January 7th, with accumulation approaching 9 feet, and with the snowfall showing no indication of ending, the families in Blackwell Hollow had to confront the reality that they might be experiencing something beyond the limits of normal weather. The snow's persistence violated their understanding of how storms worked, how atmospheric systems behaved, how winter functioned. Nothing in their experience or their inherited knowledge about frontier survival prepared them for snowfall that simply would not stop, that continued adding depth indefinitely, without the self-limiting mechanisms that normally ended precipitation events. The immediate practical concerns were mounting. The snow was approaching cabin eaves, which meant that it would soon begin putting pressure on roofs from the sides. That drifting could cover entire structures, that the cabins might become buried under the accumulation. Doors were already blocked. The only way to exit cabins was through windows on upper floors or by digging through snow that was taller than a person. Livestock were trapped in barns with dwindling food supplies, and accessing those barns to provide food or water required dangerous tunneling through snow that could collapse and suffocate anyone attempting the journey. More concerning was the trajectory. If the snow continued at its current rate, 24 inches per day, the valley would be completely filled within weeks. The hollow was perhaps 400 feet deep from ridgetop to creek bottom. At 1 inch per hour, the snow would reach ridge level in approximately 400 hours, less than 17 days. If the families could not escape the valley before the snow reached that level, they would be buried, trapped in a white void with no horizon and no possibility of rescue. The decision was made on January 8th, with accumulation at approximately 10 feet, to attempt to evacuate the hollow. The families understood that attempting to travel through 10 feet of snow on the ground, with snow continuing to fall, was extremely dangerous, that people could become lost or exhausted or buried just feet from shelter. But remaining in place while the snow continued to accumulate without limit was certain death, while attempting to reach higher ground at least offered a possibility of survival. The evacuation attempt was organized as a community effort. The 7 families would travel together, following the creek valley east toward lower elevations where the snow might be less deep, or where they might reach settlements that had not experienced the same impossible accumulation. They would travel in single file, with stronger members breaking trail through the deep snow, with weaker members and children following in the packed path, with everyone connected by ropes to prevent anyone from becoming separated or lost in the continuing snowfall that reduced visibility to a few yards. The attempt began on the morning of January 9th. The families gathered what supplies they could carry, abandoned their cabins and their possessions and their livestock to the snow, and began the desperate push through the white landscape toward escape. The progress was agonizingly slow. Breaking trail through 10 feet of fresh snow required enormous effort. The path would fill in behind them as new snow fell, and the risk of avalanche from the destabilized snow on the steep valley sides was constant and terrifying. After 6 hours of exhausting travel, the group had covered approximately 1 mile. They were exhausted, cold, and increasingly aware that they could not maintain the pace required to escape the valley before they collapsed from fatigue. The decision was made to seek shelter and rest before continuing the attempt. But finding shelter in a landscape that was entirely snow-covered proved nearly impossible. The group dug into a snowbank on the lee side of the valley wall, creating a cave-like space where they could huddle together for warmth and rest. But the snow continued to fall, and they knew that they could not remain in the shelter for long without being buried by new accumulation. After a few hours of rest, the group resumed their evacuation attempt. But morale was breaking, energy was depleted, and the youngest children were showing signs of hypothermia despite the best efforts of their parents to keep them warm. By evening of January 9th, having traveled perhaps 2 miles from their starting point, the group faced the reality that they could not continue, that attempting to push forward in darkness through deep snow with exhausted people would result in deaths from exposure or falls or simple exhaustion. The The decision was made to turn back, to return to the cabins they had left that morning, to seek shelter in structures that at least provided protection from wind and some baseline warmth from residual heat in the building's mass. The return journey was even more difficult than the outward attempt. The trail they had broken was already filling in with new snow. Darkness was falling, and the psychological weight of returning to certain burial rather than pushing toward possible escape was crushing. The group reached the vicinity of their cabins after dark, found structures that were now almost completely buried under 12 to 13 feet of snow, and had to dig down through the accumulation to reach windows that they could break through to gain entry to the buried buildings. They emerged into cold, dark interiors that smelled of abandonment even though they had been empty for only hours, and they settled in to endure what they increasingly understood might be their final days. The snow continued through January 10th, 11th, 12th. Accumulation reached 15 feet, then 18, then 20. The cabins were completely buried now, existing as air pockets under the snow, accessible only through vertical shafts that had to be continually cleared as new snow filled them in. The families lived in darkness, broken only by candles and small fires they maintained for warmth, in spaces that felt like tombs or caves more than cabins, in a muffled silence created by the insulating effect of the snow that surrounded them. Communication between families became impossible. The effort required to tunnel through 20 feet of snow to reach a neighboring cabin was too great. The risk of tunnels collapsing was too high, and supplies were too limited to waste energy on anything beyond essential survival. Each family existed in isolation, knowing that neighbors were nearby, but unable to confirm their survival or to offer assistance. The psychological toll of the continuing snowfall was as severe as the physical hardships it created. The snow's refusal to stop violated fundamental expectations about how the world worked, created a sense that natural law had failed, that the basic reliability of seasonal cycles could not be trusted. If snow could fall forever, if accumulation could continue without limit, then what other assumptions about reality might prove false? The families existed in a state of profound existential uncertainty, questioning whether they understood anything about how their world functioned. Food supplies were dwindling. The evacuation attempt had consumed supplies that had been brought along, and those supplies had not been recovered when the group returned to the cabins. Firewood that had seemed adequate for winter was being depleted rapidly as families burned wood to maintain warmth in spaces that were effectively refrigerated by the surrounding snow. And the psychological stress of confinement in darkness under accumulation that continued to increase was creating tensions and despair that threatened to break individuals' will to continue enduring. By January 15th, with accumulation estimated at 25 to 30 feet based on the difficulty of maintaining access to the surface, the families had reached a state of resignation. They could not escape, could not stop the snow, could not do anything except wait, either for the snow to finally stop or for their supplies to run out, and for death from starvation or cold or simple despair to claim them. But on the evening of January 15th, something changed. The constant sound of falling snow, a subtle pattering on the surface above the buried cabins that had been present for nearly 2 weeks, ceased. The families noticed the silence, noticed the absence of the sound they had stopped consciously hearing, but that had become a background presence defining their reality. They waited through the night, listening, hoping that the cessation was real and permanent rather than a temporary pause that would resume. Morning of January 16th confirmed that the snowfall had stopped. The skies, when tunnels were dug to the surface to check, were clear. The sun shone on a landscape that was unrecognizable. The valley had become a white plain, level from one ridge to the other, with no visible signs of the cabins or trees or creek that lay beneath 30 feet of accumulated snow. The hollow had been filled, transformed into a smooth white surface that bore no indication of the human habitation it concealed. The families emerged from their buried cabins into a world that was both familiar and utterly alien. The ridges that bounded the valley were still visible, marking the location they knew. But everything else was new. The valley floor was gone, replaced by a snow surface that was at the level of the lower ridges, that had filled the depression completely, that had created a high white plain where a hollow had been. Travel was now theoretically possible. The surface was firm enough to walk on after the extended period of accumulation and compaction, and the valley's filling meant that what had been steep slopes down into the hollow were now gentle grades up to ridge tops. The families gathered what remained of their supplies and began the journey out of the valley, walking across the top of 30 feet of snow, knowing that beneath them lay their cabins, their possessions, their livestock, everything they had built and accumulated during their years in Blackwell Hollow. The journey out of the valley took 2 days of steady travel. The families reached higher elevations and eventually descended into regions where the snow depth was normal for winter, perhaps 2 or 3 feet rather than 30. They found settlements that had experienced a heavy winter, but nothing remotely comparable to what had occurred in Blackwell Hollow. The families told their story of the snowfall that would not stop, of the valley filling completely, of the 2 weeks buried in darkness under accumulation that violated every principle of how weather should behave. The response was skepticism mixed with horror. The depth the families described seemed impossible. The duration of continuous snowfall was beyond any documented storm, and the specific localization to one valley, while surrounding regions experienced normal winter conditions, defied meteorological understanding. But the family's condition, their exhaustion, their depleted supplies, their obvious trauma, testified to an experience that had been genuinely extreme, regardless of whether the specific details were accurate or exaggerated. In the spring of 1845, when the snow had melted from most of the region, several men returned to Blackwell Hollow to assess what remained and to attempt to salvage possessions from the buried cabins. They found that the hollow still contained massive snow accumulation even in late April. Depths of 15 to 20 feet remained in the valley bottom when surrounding areas had been clear for weeks. The cabins, when finally excavated, were found to be damaged but largely intact, having survived burial under the crushing weight of 30 feet of snow better than might have been expected. But the settlement was not re-established. The families who had survived the snowfall of 1844 to 1845 refused to return to the hollow, unwilling to risk experiencing another winter in a location that had demonstrated its capacity to be filled completely with snow. The valley was abandoned, the salvaged possessions were removed, and Blackwell Hollow returned to wilderness, existing as an uninhabited drainage where no one chose to settle despite its otherwise favorable characteristics. Over subsequent winters, observers occasionally noted that Blackwell Hollow seemed to accumulate more snow than surrounding areas. that depths in the valley bottom were consistently greater than what topography alone would predict. But nothing approaching the extreme accumulation of 1844 to 1845 was ever documented again. Whatever conditions had created the impossible snowfall appeared to have been unique to that particular winter. Modern meteorological analysis of the historical accounts suggests several possible explanations for the extreme snowfall. The hollow's topography, a narrow valley between steep ridges oriented perpendicular to prevailing winter winds, could have created conditions where moisture-laden air was forced upward, causing continuous precipitation. But this mechanism, while it can create locally enhanced snowfall, does not explain accumulation rates of 24 inches per day sustained for 2 weeks, rates that far exceed anything documented in modern weather observation. Another possibility is that the historical accounts were exaggerated, that the actual accumulation was significant, but not the 30 feet claimed, that the stress and isolation of the experience led to overestimation of depths and durations. But multiple independent family accounts describe similar depths and timelines, and the physical evidence of extreme residual snow depth in spring supports the claim that accumulation was genuinely extraordinary. The most troubling possibility is that the accounts are essentially accurate, that Blackwell Hollow experienced a snowfall event that exceeded normal bounds of weather behavior, that created accumulation through mechanisms not understood by frontier observers or by modern meteorology. If this is the case, it raises questions about what conditions could create such an event and whether those conditions might recur. The hollow where the snowfall would not stop remains accessible to those willing to hike rough terrain to reach it. The valley is still narrow and steep-sided, still oriented in ways that channel wind and accumulate snow. No permanent structures exist there. The last remnants of the 1840s settlement have long since rotted away, and the area is largely unvisited except by occasional hunters or hikers who might not even realize they are walking through a location where families once lived and where snow once fell without stopping until it filled the valley completely. Reports persist of unusually heavy snow in Blackwell Hollow during winter months. Weather observers note that the valley consistently shows greater accumulation than surrounding areas even when the difference is only a foot or two, rather than the impossible 30 feet of 1844 to 1845. Whether this represents genuine localized weather enhancement, or merely the power of suggestion causing people to notice and remember snow depths that confirm the hollow's reputation, is unclear. But on rare winters, when conditions align in particular ways, when moisture is abundant and temperatures hover just below freezing and wind patterns are stable for extended periods, hikers who happen to be in the region report that snow in Blackwell Hollow can accumulate to remarkable depths over just a few days, that the valley seems to fill more quickly than physics would predict, that the snow there feels somehow denser and more persistent than snow that falls just a few hundred yards away on the ridges. These reports are never of accumulations approaching the 1844 to 1845 extreme, but they suggest that whatever topographic or atmospheric peculiarity characterizes the hollow continues to make it a location where snow behaves slightly differently, accumulates slightly more readily, persists slightly longer than it does in adjacent landscapes. The hollow retains its capacity for extreme accumulation, even if it has not demonstrated that capacity at catastrophic levels, since the winter, when 7 families watched the valley fill beneath them and had to abandon everything they had built to escape burial under snow that refused to stop falling. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark Mountains' most relentlessly accumulating mysteries, a snowfall that began normally but refused to end, that continued day after day beyond any natural limit, that filled a valley completely and forced families to flee or be buried under white, that rose higher than cabin roofs and higher than trees and higher than any storm should produce. The snowfall that lasted too long stands as a reminder that the self-limiting mechanisms we trust to end winter storms might not be as reliable as we need them to be. That accumulation could theoretically continue indefinitely if the conditions that normally terminate snowfall fail to arrive, and that being buried is a terror that can be slow and inexorable rather than sudden and violent. A process of watching the white rise day by day and knowing that it shows no sign of stopping and that eventually it will reach levels that nothing can survive. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where snow fell without ending and where valleys filled until they became level plains, concealing everything beneath them, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between normal weather and impossible accumulation, between winter storm and burial. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how long you could endure watching snow fall without stopping, on whether you would attempt escape or shelter in place, on what it means when the cycles we depend on refuse to complete. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about snow accumulation and the assumption that it will eventually stop, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate mysteries that remind us that the weather patterns we trust to end might sometimes continue beyond all reason, beyond all precedent, until the landscape itself is transformed and buried under accumulation that should not be possible, but that continues regardless, inch by inch, hour by hour, day by day. Until our next journey into territories where winter refuses to end and where valleys become tombs of white, watch the snow when it falls, count the hours it continues, and remember that somewhere in the Ozark Mountains there is still a hollow that fills more readily than it should, where snow accumulates beyond prediction, and where families once watched for 2 weeks as a snowfall that should have stopped in hours instead continued day after day until it had filled their valley completely and forced them to flee across the top of 30 feet of snow or be buried beneath it, knowing that below them lay everything they had built and owned and established, all of it entombed under white that had risen without pause until the valley itself ceased to exist.